There we go. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Well, I appreciate everybody who's here on time. Thank you very much. We're just waiting for everybody to log on, but good afternoon. I'll probably will officially greet everybody as soon as I think the numbers have increased a little bit. So just bear with us. We'll start shortly. Okay. Well, I think it's 2:30. So first of all, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tendai. I'm the in-house account manager here at the Civil Service College. I'll be your host for Unlocking Your Leadership Potential, our webinar, which is going to be delivered by my colleagues Ben and Bleasdale, as well as Keith. Welcome, everybody, international partners, local, as well as our peers, as well as our stakeholders. It's nice for everybody to join us again. And for those who are returning on one of our webinars, thank you. We always appreciate the support. So, without further ado, we're probably just going to explain who we are as a college, what we do, and from there, I'll let Keith and Ben take over. So, who are we? CSC, we focus on understanding organizations, training needs, and delivering bespoke solutions. So our tailor-made approach means that we work with you at every step to create a bespoke training course that meets your specific objectives. In the UK, we're a trusted supplier to many government departments. So, for example, Home Office, NHS Civil Service Commission, and College of Policing. And our most popular series, of courses include Accountability and Governance, as well as Leadership and Management. Now, without further ado, I'll pass it on to my colleague Ben, and let's start our webinar. Let's go.
Super. Thank you so much for the introduction, Tendai. And more importantly, sorry, Tendai, thank you all for joining and taking what is a proactive step in starting to develop your leadership or continuing your leadership development journey. Hello?
It's all right, Ben. Sorry, I was just going to say, yeah, if you don't mind, if we can keep, for just housekeeping purposes, can we keep our microphones switched off? We're happy even if you're switching your cameras. I mean, it's fine, but for interactive purposes, let's just keep the microphones off so that Ben can at least do the presentation properly. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. It's difficult when there's so many in the room, and I'm so glad that there are so many here. And I think it's a great indication that there's a general recognition that strong leadership, essentially bringing out the best in people, is an increasingly important focus area, if not a critical focus area, in a continuingly kind of ever-challenging and ever-changing world that we work in. I like to start these types of sessions off by sharing my favourite leadership quote, which is a definition of a leader by Meg Wheatley, which says, "A leader is anyone who wants to make a difference." I like it because it particularly relates to this session that leadership is a skill set and not just a title. And it's a bit of a clear indicator that leadership and management, whilst they're quite often interchangeably used terms, there is a clear distinction between the two. And whilst management requires a bit of positional power and authority and a title, leadership is for everyone. It's anyone who wants to make a difference, but it is a skill set and not just a title. So let's crack on with the start of the session. And I'll introduce this book to some of you. It may well be familiar. You might have read it, or you might have been on the corresponding training program, which we've been running with Civil Service College for, by my judgment, about 4 or 5 years now. It's been really successful, really popular, and just introduces a few insights, tools, leadership behaviors that form a bit of a foundation stone to our leadership development journeys. And before I go any further, you might have seen the tiny writing there, but Keith Bleasdale, the author of the book, and it's probably now a good time to let him introduce himself. So go ahead, Keith.
Well, thank you, Ben, and good afternoon, or whatever your time zone is today. Welcome from me as well as from Ben. My background, just very briefly, I mean, Ben will mostly run the session, but I will be here, and so please do use chat. Kim Porter, all the way from Jamaica, thank you for kicking us off in chat as well before we get started. But we'll do our best that we can to pick up on any of your chat comments or questions. For me, just building on what Ben said, my background is I was in a finance role, working in corporate finance for about 15 plus years in my career. And I did a master's degree in leadership down at Exeter University in the UK. And it was a fascinating 4 years of study. And really what it brought home to me was that whilst leadership is a privilege, and we're always proud when we're in a leadership position in our careers, it's also a great responsibility as well. And it's not just the responsibility to create high performance amongst our colleagues. It's a requirement or responsibility to make sure that people enjoy what they do, that they develop and grow in areas that they want to be able to progress their careers. And of course, these days, particularly with mental wellness as a focus, but I think all aspects of health, actually, I think the leader that we work with and for has a big impact on our life in so many ways. So when you see the book Leading with Impact, I think we shouldn't forget just the scale of the impact. And the great news is, I don't think being a strong leader is that difficult. You've just got to understand what it is and work on the skill sets that will help you be that. So look forward to chipping in over the next hour. But Ben, I will hand back to you at this point.
Thank you, Keith. And yeah, I think just to reinforce what Keith said there, it's Leader with Impact is essentially it's that one-stop. It's the Leadership 101, the foundation stone, which teaches us some of the fundamentals that will get us a long way in addressing the major responsibility that we have as leaders, all of us. Another tool that we'll often use, I just want to mention this, while these aren't going to be the focus of today's session, they do form a bit of an intro as to where we're going. A tool we use, a framework around leadership to help us start to self-reflect on what we're like as leaders, because it can be quite a hazy subject, really, leadership and what great leadership looks like. So we introduced the 5R framework and start to plot ourselves and where our key strengths lie, where some of our potential development areas lie, and where we can find real growth as a leader in general terms. And these are traits that leaders possess, great leaders the world over. And what it also does is help establish a bit of a common understanding and a common language across an organization around leadership and what it looks like. So these are the leadership fundamentals, essentially, and they do go a long way in developing us. But ultimately, great leadership, as nice as it would be, isn't a one-size-fits-all. It depends on all of the personal pressures that we face, the challenges that our team are under, or our organization, or the government department, whatever it might be in your world. But there's so many variables to consider in what we need to address as individuals to tackle our leadership journey as appropriately as possible. All our challenges are unique, and therefore our approach to leadership should be unique too. So with that in mind, can I go break to our first kind of chat question? And it's a really simple question. There are no wrong answers, so I really appreciate your honest thoughts. And I'll ask the question and then I'll pause for a moment to let you think and write your answers. And it's this: what do you consider to be the biggest leadership challenge that leaders face today? What do you consider to be the biggest leadership challenge that leaders face today? I'll pause for a moment now.
Oh, the first one, dealing with mental health, people, harnessing resources, or integrity, mental health again, honesty and integrity, shifting priorities, hybrid working, that's a good one as well. Being knowledgeable and understanding, hybrid teams, second time it's come up, just as well as mental health. Oh, identity, yeah, that's usually, especially this time, it's constant change. Interesting, I like that one. Uniting people with different opinions. Economic factors on both, that's companies, yeah. What else we have? Financial climate, true. Fake news and multi-loyalties. Kamala, thank you for that one. Simon Baker dealing with dispersed team with increased hybrid working. That's something very common at the moment. That's true. Financial challenges. intergenerational demographic in the teams. That's from Kenyi Karima from Barking. I like that one. Hybrid working, again, that's from Stuart. Hybrid working and the effect it is having on people's mental health. So I think the general consensus so far has been the mental health aspect as well as hybrid working. So keeping people's attention, so many distractions. That's from Jennifer Balmer. Then I've got Brian Kinney, constant change. Petra, thank you for that, conflicting priorities. Gail, generational gaps in ways of working. Interesting one as well, that one. Like that one. Let's keep them coming, guys. Keeping all members of a team happy and motivated when people work in different ways and have different needs. That's from Natalie Blackburn. Thank you, Natalie, for that. Abigail, constant changes. Then we've got Lorraine as well. Expectations. That's an interesting one as well. Yvonne, employees' home life balance. First person to say that. That's very interesting. Then we've got poor leadership and role models. That's Karima again. Thank you for that. Bullying in the workplace.
Well, thank you, Tendai, and there's so many of you. I appreciate all of these answers. I'll give Keith an opportunity to jump in on any that stood out for him. There's certainly ones that stood out for me. But Keith, what do you think?
You're on mute for us, Keith. So
I was so keen not to interrupt the audio. Yeah, I think there's some very significant key themes coming out there, aren't there? Really, for me, I'd capture probably hybrid as a specific, and the impact of hybrid. And the demands for people who want to work hybrid, or less commonly, but also a case they don't want to work hybrid. Then you've got pace of change, which I think was the one really that I typed in actually. Just the pace and pressure of life actually, and then wellness, and then the whole spectre of diversity, which I think is increasingly something we need to be on our front foot with. Leadership is about being on your front foot, and I think that diversity is a great example of where, we mustn't sort of lag behind and support it from the background. We've got to role model it. We've got to show it. So I think there's some fantastic ones there. And also the other thing I'd say, Ben, before I hand back to you is, just look at the length of the list and the things in there. And I said something quite bold at the start, which was that I don't think leadership is particularly difficult. And what I meant by that was I don't think it's difficult to understand what it is, because it's about influence, but it's the application of the leadership that's tough. And it gives us a nod really to why Ben and I, we always look to bespoke things. And Ben will talk more about that a bit later. And that can mean many things. That might mean a 1-hour conversation just to check we know what the issues are that you're facing. So we come in and we try and support in the right areas, right through to something very specific to an organizational problem that exists, etc. So thank you. Gosh, the list is coming in. So anyway, that would be my start for 10, Ben, but I'll hand back to you at this point.
Well, thank you very much. And in the interest of time, I won't share too many of my thoughts, but other than I totally agree with you, just the staggering length of that list is testament to the fact that I guess the main point we're trying to make here, that leadership and how we approach it is very different. My ideal approach to leadership in my role might look completely different to yours, depending on the challenges that we face. And clearly this spectrum of challenges is huge. So let me just quickly highlight a case study of a program that we've been working on for a couple of years and continue to work on with a major international airline. It's a client of ours, and what I really want to highlight here is the impact that tailoring and bespoking leadership development can have on the outcome. So what our client, this airline, came to us with the challenge, these unprecedented industry challenges, not least, of course, COVID and all of the associated travel restrictions, but continued global political instability, wars, increasing oil prices, all just led to this perfect storm of challenge for their industry that had never really been seen before. So they identified, and I think really wisely, strong leadership, not just at the upper echelons of their business, but across the business. Once again, reiterating this point that leadership is for everyone. It's not about position, it's a skill set for everyone to possess. They identified leadership as the critical factor in maintaining success throughout these challenging times. And the solution was to develop a series of tailored leadership programs designed collaboratively with us, but essentially in partnership with their key stakeholders, the people that really understand the ins and outs of the challenges that they were facing, the pressures that they were under, dependent on the department and the particular challenges that they were facing. And so far, these types of interventions have been delivered to thousands of people across their organisation. And this is what the breakdown currently looks like, as simply as I can possibly show it. So we've delivered role-specific leadership development intervention. I think the best example of this is with cabin crew and the managers in flight. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but every flight has one cabin crew manager who they probably will never work with the same cabin staff ever in their whole careers. They can work there decades and never see the same face twice, let alone work with the same team, with the same team dynamic. Of course, all of their customers, the passengers, change every single flight. And the pilot, their manager in flight, they change almost every single flight. And so it's a very unique, very complex and personal set of challenges that they face from a leadership perspective. And so we tailored an event which worked for them. And in terms of bespoking, it doesn't always have to be a big, daunting or time-consuming or, most importantly, costly process doing a kind of learning needs analysis. But there are examples like this where it's completely unique, where you think they need something very specialist to address their needs. And so that was an example of that. We've then, and I think most importantly, run this business-wide leadership program, which has had thousands of people pass through. And it's the one that really addresses this need for leadership across the business and takes on board that recognition that leadership is for everyone. But your leadership priorities will be different depending on where you're situated throughout an organization. And so the leadership pressures on the executive tier are different from the leadership pressures on the management tier, and are different for those who potentially don't have any direct reports or teams around them, but nonetheless, they still have influence. And in fact, the ability to influence people when you don't have the additional pressure of a title or of boss or manager can actually make things a little bit easier for you to create that influence and leadership. So there's programs tailored to each of those tiers of the organization. We've also run operational team programs, and an example of this is across that executive tier, trying to encourage them to work in a not just collaboratively as a team, but also cohesive across the top. So a lot of the time we get these directors who are absolutely focused on the performance of their own silo of the organization, and sometimes lose a bit of sight of the fact that their own success, if there's failure around them, means nothing long term. And so to work cohesively and collaboratively, both upward and across an organization, is critical. And finally, skills development programs that we've run to focus on those leaders, perhaps the opposite to the cabin crew, who have more consistent teams working around them, the ability to form long-standing relationships and focus on a more coaching approach. So we'll focus the leadership development more around coaching or performance development in some of those instances. And so how's it all worked? Is it all working? Well, we're really proud to have achieved and still be achieving an average feedback score of over 9 out of 10 across the board on all of these programs, which in our industry is a figure to be really proud of, I'd say. And I'm delighted with everyone working on this. And for any trainer, this is the one number that you're really focused on bringing up. But all of it would mean nothing without organizational performance increasing on the back of it. And they've actually just released their latest annual report, this airline, which has shown all of the performance metrics across the board to be absolutely thriving, and they're having one of the best years in recent history, despite a continued industrial downturn around them. And I'm not too egotistical to think that's all they're doing, but at least in some small way, that is to do with this focus on leadership across the business that's having this major positive impact for them. So that's it. And like I say, the main point I want to make here is that in some instances, conducting a learning needs analysis for your leadership development program can be a big thing, but it doesn't have to be. And in a lot of cases, and a lot of these cases even, all it is a 1-hour conversation and a bit of self-reflection from key stakeholders who understand the challenges that are going on and that they're faced with, so that we can come in and provide insights which address those specifically, because as we've established in the chat, that looks very different for everyone. So I'm going to try and break down leadership and the challenges that we're faced with a little bit more in a way that doesn't just drown us too much. So it's not an exhaustive list, as your chat has proven, But here we have the 3 common breakdowns of what leadership looks like and the angles that we can take a look at leadership from that we really need to focus on. So there's leading self, focusing on our leadership, personal brand, our emotional intelligence, our self-awareness and self-management, and how people perceive us as a leader. And then there's leading teams, which is more probably the most conventional approach to looking at leadership, because leading without followers means nothing, and the followers are how we influence those teams around us. And finally, leading the business, all the self-awareness and all the team camaraderie in the world means nothing long-term without organizational performance and making sure that things are headed in the right direction, and recognizing that our success depends on more than just our organization. Nothing exists in a bubble. Business is an ecosystem, and we've got to consider all of that ecosystem, internal and external, if we're to be successful. Now, before I skip on, I'll mention 2 things. Number one, I was pleased to see in the comments one of the early ones that Tendai read out. I think it was handling opposing opinions, which is perfectly related to this conflict handling that we're going to discuss first. And in the interest of time, we are just going to dip into one of each of these 3 columns, the bottom one from each section, starting with conflict handling. But before I do that, I'll just leave this up for a moment. I would encourage this to be the slide that if you're to take a screenshot or a photo on your phone, whatever works for you, as the best one to take away, reflect on after this session, and think about which of these areas resonate with you and resonate with challenges that your organization is facing. It's not an exhaustive list, but there's a lot there, and they tend to be the types of challenges that we do come across most. So I'll leave it for a few more seconds before we move on. Okay, so conflict handling. Like I say, it did come up in the chat and I was pleased to see that. But just to get things straight for everyone, I think it's really important to recognize that conflict is an important word to reframe, because the context we hear it in these days is usually on the news if there's a war going on, or if we hear about it referred to in the working world, it's about some kind of dispute or major argument going on in fighting and all of that negative stuff. But what conflict is, in very simple terms, is a difference of opinion between people or parties. It's that simple. I work this way, you want to work that way. How do we move forward? And so research suggests, just last year, this research was released, that managers spend around 6 to 10 hours per week solving conflicts. So of 5 days, that's 1 whole day per week resolving conflicts, which at face value, even though we know conflict can be a positive thing, feels like a bit of a drag and a bit of a burden. But we have to recognise that, number one, even with an untrained group of managers, they weren't specialist conflict handlers, 76% of these conflicts resulted in a positive outcome. And indeed, the more we develop our ability to handle conflict, and not just handle our own conflicts, but facilitate conflicts going on in our own teams, the more we can draw out these really positive effects of conflict handling. And what do these effects look like? What do organizations who have demonstrated really high levels of proactivity and encouragement of drawing out conflict? These are the sort of statistics that you can expect to see on the back of this positive, proactive approach to conflict handling. 41% better understanding of others. Of course, when we talk about each other's ideas and perspectives, we understand them better, which leads to a 33% improved level of relationships, because this handling of conflict requires a bit of empathy, and there's nothing like empathy that brings people closer. It also draws out better solutions, of course, because my way of doing things, or my opinion, and your opinion, neither are probably absolutely spot on. So it takes a bit of collaboration and discussion to draw out the better solutions. On the back of this, there's 21% higher team performance, of course, because we're all collaborating more, we're all more engaged. Engagement being such a big buzzword in business more and more these days, and so closely linked to motivation. Obviously, great things to have, and reasons why we should absolutely focus on conflict handling rather than make conflict something that we try and avoid. Because if you avoid conflict, then nothing changes, and then you stagnate. And if nothing changes, then nothing changes, and we don't move anywhere. So there's no standstill option in life or in our working lives. Conflict's the way we move forward. So that's why conflict handling is so important. But here's a little bit of a model that we'll use. We can't go into that much depth of what a whole conflict handling program would look like, but it would tend to be centered around this, the Thomas Kilmann instrument, or TKI, as it's more commonly known. It's the world's most popular conflict mode conflict handling model and also self-reflection tool, because it highlights what our preferred style tends to be. And it outlines this framework of, based upon how assertive we are and how cooperative we are when faced with conflict, we'll tend to fall into one of these default approaches, default styles to conflict handling, these 5 words down the middle: competing, collaborating, compromising, avoiding, and accommodating. And again, on face value, some of those appear more attractive than others. But each of them has a place, time and a place to be deployed. Like all things leadership, it's very much situational. And so it's no good being, oh, well, I'm a natural collaborator, so I don't need to change my approach to things. If all we ever do is take an explorative, educational, expansive approach, try and consider everyone's options with every small decision and take everything to committee, nothing will ever get done, no one ever goes home. So maybe competing is a better option. It's quick, decisive, and proactive. But if you only ever do things your way, you're not going to be very popular, sadly. And popularity is, of course, a key element of leadership. So there's pros and cons to each of these things, and it's a start point of where we would take any conflict handling intervention, by helping people recognize where their default style lies and also what the default style of their team looks like. Because culturally, we do start to shift towards one style or another. And it's important to understand the standards and preferences of our own team that we're getting into conflicts with and we're facilitating conflicts of. So that's conflict handling. I want to just ask you another quick question, if I may. We've not gone to any depth, but the words down the middle, these conflict handling styles, they're all fairly intuitive. So I'm always intrigued to hear what people feel like their standard, their preferred style of conflict handling would be. So in the chat, please do share with me, what's your gut feel? Where do you think you tend to approach conflict handling from, of those 5 approaches?
Right. So Ben, there's a few words here: collaborating, compromising, accommodating, sorry, I should say. Collaborating, depending on the situation, but collaborating, compromising, competing. So it's a mixture.
Yeah, nice one. Well, for starters, I think it's good to recognise that there is a mixture, because we can tend to think, oh, well, yeah, I'm collaborative, everyone around me is collaborative, and that's how we tend to work. And that's how people tend to function. But by recognising there's other people in very different circumstances with different approaches, it helps us see that even if we're coming up against, we're a collaborator, but someone else is a competitor, we might have to adapt our style a little bit to continue being able to collaborate. And if we are a default collaborator, also recognising that it's a great place to be a lot of the time, but sometimes it's not the most appropriate. And so recognising sometimes when we're faced with conflict, we've got to press pause and consider our options before moving forward. So I won't spend any more time on conflict handling, but that, of course, on any kind of leadership development program related to conflict handling, we go into a lot more depth and exploration and keep things very active and participative and engaging. That's always our focus, never death by PowerPoint. So yeah, let's move back to this spectrum of leadership challenges and themes. And we're going to go this time to a related topic, actually, under the leading teams column, negotiating win-win outcomes. It's related, of course, because all negotiations start with a conflict. And remember, that conflict means a difference of opinion, a difference of start point. And of course, that's where negotiation begins. And also, I want to reiterate that negotiation isn't just a skill required for anyone working in sales or procurement. We tend to think of negotiation as a word that's associated with financial transactions, but negotiation isn't necessarily that at all. It goes to every single dispute or conflict or difference of opinion that we might have in any sense in a workplace. And how this tends to play out by our very human nature, if we were playing 2 games of noughts and crosses side by side, they'd probably look a little bit like this. I'd go there, it's me against you. And you'd go, oh, well, I'll start a line over here. Then I'd go here, and you might think, well, I'm not going to win if I don't go there. And so on and so forth. We keep blocking each other off, looking after ourselves on our own best interests, which essentially leads to no one winning. And in any negotiation and leading people through negotiations, of course, you want to establish win-win outcomes. And that all begins with establishing an environment and a culture of an outward mindset, of recognizing that my success without your success means nothing in the big picture. So why don't we approach tasks a little bit more like this? And it might seem like, once again, a bit like well, we're all collaborators, aren't we? That seems like the best place to be. We actually run an activity, a group activity called Red Card, Blue Card, with this exercise quite a lot. And it essentially demonstrates that every single time, we must have run it 100 times, the results of these sort of activities end up looking like this. We're naturally competitive. We naturally look after ourselves. And without being encouraged and establishing a culture different to that, we never really automatically default to this approach. And so it's the leader's responsibility to establish this win-win outcome culture. And so that's a little bit abstract. And so let's take things down to more the brass tacks and look at a good negotiation model, which it always helps to establish any negotiation. There's going to be these same factors, these same considerations that we need to be thinking of, whether it's a big deal or a small deal. We need to go into them having considered these markers, because that's just going to give us the upper hand in any kind of negotiation. So we've got to first figure out what's our most favored position. What do we want to achieve if we could get everything we want? And we've also therefore got to establish the walkaway point. At what point in this negotiation is it not worth my time or investment or energy? And I just think I will walk away from this one. And then realistically, because we do want to get a win-win, it's not all about me and it's not all about you. What's the realistic target point that you think can be achieved? And so in establishing all of this, you come up with your zone of possible agreement. But that's not the only way, because through discussions and conflict and negotiation, we also come up with this BATNA, the best alternative to negotiated agreement. It might well be that we don't just want to divide the cake. We want to go back to the bakery and consider what other pies they might have. They might have two, and so we can have one each. And so it's going back to the drawing board. Sometimes we don't have to walk away. We consider alternatives. And finally, there's the peed off position. Not a good place to be. And essentially, the point to highlight here is recognizing that we never want to make our most favored position the peed off position. If I went into a Porsche dealership and offered them £1,000 for their Porsche 911, they'd probably just show me the door, and that would be the end of the discussion. So we've got to be realistic about our positions here. And again, from the outset, recognize we want to go in for a win-win. So this is just a bit of a model, a classic framework of negotiations that just helps us outline what we want to be thinking about before we head into negotiations, or we facilitate negotiations of others as a leader. And interspersed throughout this, there's going to be all kinds of different, psychological hacks and behavioral tips that we can utilize in giving us the upper hand in working through a negotiation, essentially. One that springs to mind, by the way, a psychological hack, I really love this one, is that when laying out the terms of a negotiation, if you put their side on the table first, so if you can do this for me, I will do this. The impact that has on your success in a negotiation is massive, just compared to if you spin it the other way around and say, I'll do this for you if you do that. Because in their minds, you've already given them something. So why would they give you something? And it seems ridiculous, but it has a massive impact. And so that's just a little one that springs to mind, but there's all kinds of little tidbits that we'll pick up on this type of session. So once again, we don't have too much time. I can't get into too much detail, but that's just a bit of an outline of what negotiating win-win outcomes tends to be framed around, and recognizing that an outward mindset is critical if we want to achieve this win-win outcome scenario more often. And that brings us back a final time to this leading the business column. And we're going to look at optimizing stakeholder relationships. And it's one that's, I think, so often overlooked. We can think about our immediate team or ourselves without necessarily paying too much attention to all the noise going on around us, whether that's internally or externally. And to be truly successful individually or as an organization, we've got to recognize that, like I said previously, we work in an ecosystem. No organization exists in its own bubble. You can't be successful in that way. And you've got to start thinking about how to optimize the stakeholder relationships, both internally and externally. And so this is what these type of sessions tend to be focused on. And they start from this psychological standpoint where we can assess every single one of our key stakeholder relationships on this type of matrix, which assesses where we stand and how we tend to interact with certain people based on what we call life positions. I'm okay or I'm not okay, and you're okay and you're not okay. And unlike some of these matrices, the best place to be in every case here is at the top right in this I'm okay, you're okay, assertive position. And similarly, we all tend to go into these things thinking, yeah, well, that's where I find myself with most people all of the time. I don't need to give too much more thought to this. But it is only with a bit of deeper consideration and group discussion and personal reflection that we do start to recognize, wow, there are lots of relationships that either I completely neglect that could have an impact on how I perform, or indeed that I'm just not in the right place on this matrix. And the one that I like to demonstrate the example of where you might be in this passive aggressive box at the bottom left, where at first thought you might think, surely I'm never down there. But we're all answerable to someone when it comes to budgets, and whoever does hold the purse strings for you, we tend to often find ourselves in this passive aggressive point because we feel like, well, you're not okay because you're controlling me, you're controlling what I do and how I spend, and you don't seem to give me much say in this. And I'm not okay because, well, I don't have much say in this, so I'm not going into this as a adult level relationship. And so we tend to interact a bit more passively aggressively in those types of relationships. But I can almost guarantee that no one will find themselves in this upper right box in every relationship. And it's key, if we want to optimize those stakeholder relationships, that we first look at this. Amongst other things, I mentioned adult, so we'll look at parent, adult, child, and reflect on how we interact with people on that level. You might be familiar with that model or not. Again, sorry, we don't have time to unpack too much, but here's a final model which we will almost always frame these types of optimizing stakeholder relationships sessions around, and we call it the perception ladder. And it's recognizing that to all of our stakeholders, they will see us somewhere on this ladder. And I've brought up there the 4 different positions we can find ourselves in, the way we're perceived by the stakeholders around us. And we're different, just like with the previous matrix, every relationship's different. And it might seem a bit misconceiving, this one, because it looks like, well, obviously the top of the ladder, it's bright green box, that's the place you want to be all of the time. But it's not necessarily the case. Sometimes in the red box at the bottom, that's absolutely where you want to be. It just depends on the expectations that are upon you and the perception that your stakeholders have of you and what they need from you. So I like to highlight, bring this to life with a very relatable example of sandwiches. A commodity broker of sandwiches is your petrol station off the cooler section. You know, it's efficient. It's an honest supplier. When you're on your way home from a late shift and you're stopping to get petrol and you're peckish, that's where you stop. And that's exactly what you need in that moment. So you don't want anything more fancy. Sometimes that's exactly where you want to position yourself. But naturally, we don't feel like, oh, that's where I ought to be. But it is worth reflecting on if that's a good place to be. A service provider, one step rung up the ladder, might be somewhere a bit more like Subway. Yeah, they're good to work with. They're responsive to my needs. I get a bit of customization and personalization, but there's no real relationship there. They just give me a bit more service and I pay a slight premium for it. And then you've got a value adder. That's your local sandwich shop. They say hello when you come in and they ask you if you want your usual. And on your way out, they may ask, do you want to sample the latest cake and tell us what you think next time you come in? So they do that bit more. They're very responsive and proactive and providing a bit extra. And finally, above even that is the business partner. It's an equal parts relationship, and there's a recognition that you're integral to each other's success. An example of that with sandwiches might be a sort of high-end catering company for training courses, and every trainer will understand that a training day is made or broken on how good the lunches are, and they've got to understand dietary requirements, taste requirements, numbers, and both parties have to recognize that the overall success is completely dependent on both of us. And so we'd encourage people on these types of programs to start to recognize what's the ideal place that you want to position yourself with all of your stakeholders, because the answer is not always as obvious as you might think. You don't always want to be up at the top of the ladder. You'll never have any time. You won't be able to apply the same level of commitment to everyone. So you've got to think wisely about this. And so this all comes together in a bit of a stakeholder map, which is completely personal to each individual. Who are the people around us that I have influence on, that influence me? Because that's what leadership is. It starts with influencing others and creating a positive change. And to do that, we've got to recognise that we're not independent. We are working as part of an ecosystem. And so optimizing stakeholder relationships is absolutely critical. So I will go back to the opening slide, this one here, and now just really break for if there's any questions of any of the content that's been talked through so far, or indeed if there's any of the other subjects there, or any that you brought up earlier that aren't on here. I'm conscious things like hybrid working. I mean, we do deliver events on that type of thing, and it's an important subject these days. Things like building relationship and trust in a hybrid world. It's yeah, so important, and absolutely well done for highlighting that, but it's not here. So whether it's on here or it's not on here, please feel free at this point to just ask any questions. We can delve into them a bit more depth if you wanted to. So yeah, I'll pause again for a little bit just to let any thoughts creep out.
It's a bit too late, Ben. I've got Colin asking, what about empowering others? That's Colin's question.
Okay, yeah, I'm just trying to think if there's something on there. Well, I guess we don't really have that on there, although it certainly would play into this column of leading teams. I'll, if I may, Keith, I think you might be the best position to.
Yeah. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, and thanks, Colin, for the question, and it's a great one, really. One of the things we do on the programs, Colin, is we look at how and why leadership is changing. And sadly, in a way, I'm old enough to remember many different leadership styles over the decades I've been in my working life. But if you look at where leadership is headed and probably is today, is really around, it's a word we call co-creation, where co-creation simply means inclusive leadership. Everybody gets involved. And it attaches very neatly to the concept of coaching, which is about bringing out the best in other people. And so in terms of empowerment, we very much talk about that in terms of co-creation and in coaching. And if we have any leadership theorists on the call today, you'll be very familiar with the good old Tannenbaum-Schmidt continuum, which looks at the different styles that leaders can adopt, all the way from tell and then sell, etc., all the way through to empower. And so you're right. Well, we can, and I think there's somebody mentioned earlier generational studies, Colin. I think many will agree. I think there's a higher expectation these days. I don't want to be ageist, certainly because I'm at the wrong end of the spectrum. However, I think the younger generations, or maybe let's just call them the modern generations, whatever age they might happen to be, there is a greater appetite for empowerment and a wish for the ability to have their say. So absolutely, Colin, it's a great question. It's very, very topical, and it definitely features heavily in the type of work that we do.
Just to build on that, sorry, Keith, what is not mentioned on this list, of course, as I mentioned, but in the Leader with Impact program, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that one, Colin, the co-creation idea and this evolution of what leadership looks like and how it's evolved to become more about empowerment. That's very much involved as part of the introduction to that session. And so, yeah, it's 100% agree. It's a really important topic.
So I've got two other questions for you, gentlemen. I'll probably ask them both. So the first one is from KK Kuganasen. She's asking, optimizing SH will include empowering too. I don't know if that was a question, KK, so if you could probably just expand that for us. And the second one was from Linda Huth, and Linda said, or motivating. So most probably that's just responding to what you were talking about, but there's another logo question here. User, no name, but it's W. Can you share some resources in helping to empower others? Much of my role as a leader is creating the right support and momentum for others to be empowered to take things forward.
Yeah, Ben, is it okay if I jump in?
Yes, yeah, please do.
Yeah. I think if I can just jump to the resources question first of all. I think there's many books out there. I think in terms of coaching, for the person who raised that, I think an excellent book not least because it's extremely simple and quick to read. Frankly, in our busy lives, it's a useful thing, but I think it's a high impact book, and it's called The Coaching Habit. From the author is called Michael Bungay Stanier, and it's a bestseller, and I think it's an extremely well written book in terms of how you can lead in a way that brings out the best in others. So I think that's a great book. There is actually a book if you want to go back.
Write that book in the chat for us, Keith?
Yes,
Sorry.
I'll drop it in, Tendai. Yeah, absolutely. I'll do it when I finish speaking, Tendai.
Thank you.
The other one, there is actually a book called ZAP, ZAPP, which looks at the concept of empowerment. And then I think other leadership books, dare I even say it, my own. Somebody's The Coaching Habit, Less Change Forever. So yes, Sylvia, thank you very much. You've even put the link in for that book, but that's The Coaching Habit. I'd recommend that. So there's ZAP as well that I would recommend for sure. And dare I say it, Leading with Impact. In my book, we talk about the need to bring out the best in others, and we have a chapter on coaching as well. So they would be useful. I think in terms of Linda's, I think the shareholder one, Tendai, that you drew out, I'm just having a quick scroll. She says, yes, I think she's just responding on motivating on that one. That's what that is.
Any more questions? Please ask away, please. There's nothing relevant.
And by the way, I do understand that this being such a broad topic as we've covered, it does take a bit of reflection time to think about, well, where do you currently sit within this, and where are your challenges? And so I totally understand that if the questions aren't coming to mind right now, there's also a lot of people to share that can be a bit daunting. But yeah, by all means, we'll get on to how to contact us and take things further with your questions and queries. So yeah.
I've got Gina here. Gina's asked, how can you suggest to build contacts as a new leader, getting buy-in from others? Getting a buy-in from others, I think she says.
Yeah. Well, of course, that I think blends actually very nicely with the question that I think we were a little bit confused about, but I think I've got it now, which is from Kamala. Thank you, from Kingston Hospital. This was optimizing. I think SH presumably means shareholder. I'm assuming that's what it means. Will include empowering too. So linking that then to Gina's question, we form contacts with other people by design. It doesn't, I mean, it can happen naturally, of course, but we have a little phrase which is the difference between networking and not working is one letter, and so you better make sure you get it right. And it's a slightly tongue-in-cheek answer, but it does show the importance of creating a connection, because as Ben has said a few times in this session, leadership is about influence fundamentally, not about power. And I mean, some leaders do have power, and that's fine, that's helpful in some contexts, but more often than not, it's not about power, it's about influence. And so the shareholder slide that Ben shared, the perception ladder, when we really get into talking about that and working about where are you on that, why would I want to connect with you? What is it that you offer me? And how do I perceive you, which is the point of the perception ladder? How do I perceive you? Those things drive how well we connect. We always smile and say, you know, when you call someone and your name comes up on their smartphone, do they grimace or do they grin? And you know, it can be different for different people. So it's building those things, and we look at the power of strong connections. So we all need a small number of people, or a relatively small number of people, that we connect very strongly with. But actually, a lot of success comes from having what's curiously known as weak ties, and actually they're positive things, but they're weak ties with many individuals outside of our immediate circle. And some people are just simply better at working on. There's no skill involved, really. Actually, it's just about awareness and discipline to say, how do I make sure that I just keep those connections going, so I have those contacts and it aids my influence. So I hope that goes some way to answering the question, Gina and Kamala.
I've got another one for you, Keith. We've got Dilia. Dilia's got a hand up. I don't know if she's got a question for us, Dilia. Unless you pressed it by mistake.
Oh, I do. I'm going to be brave and say it. with my actual voice rather than in the chat.
Sure.
Thank you. So I'm the one who was asking about empowerment, and Keith, I really enjoyed your response to that. Thank you. I just wanted to check, so the difference between sort of empowering people and coaching. So in my role, I'm creating structures to help support and empower others to take forwards work. It's not the same as a traditional kind of managerial role where I'm kind of individually coaching people. So I just love to know if the resources you mentioned, is that also about empowering others and structures to empower others rather than kind of like one-to-one, meetings and dialogue?
I got you. Yeah, thanks, Delia. Thanks for the clarification, and thank you for speaking up. That's much appreciated. It's nice to hear a voice.
Thank you.
The human connection. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think first of all, coaching is relevant because as a style, coaches are focusing on, number one, believing in other people's potential, and number two, listening to them and helping them work out how to do things for themselves predominantly. So of course that links very nicely with empowerment. But you are very right, and coaching is a skill that fits within that kind of way of working. It's not the same as empowerment per se. And I think really we're in addition to what I've been saying previously, Delia, what's interesting is when we look at the different ways in which you can lead. And one of the styles we talk about is leadership from behind. So basically the model is from the front, from alongside, and from behind. So as an acronym, it's FAB, and it's a great model. It's fundamentally, by the way, situational leadership. If you remember that model, it's probably about 50 years old. I just think FAB's a little bit more up to date, and it's a little bit easier to comprehend and more relevant for today. So leadership from behind, we do talk about all of the skills that are needed and the scenarios when it's appropriate. It's not always appropriate, of course, but when it is. So yes, Delia, we do talk very specifically about how you adopt that style of empowerment. And with all of the styles, my final point at this moment is every style has its benefits and it has the right time and right place when it's appropriate. But always be aware every style can be overdone. And of course, too much empowerment makes it look like you're not interested. So everyone else has to get on with it. So it's all about balance with these things. But I hope that helps, Delia.
That's great, thank you. And with the books you mentioned, are they helpful resources then for this?
Yeah, they are. They're very good. Yes, and you're Leading with Impact. Our book talks about front and alongside and behind as well as leadership styles. So yeah, they would definitely help.
Fab, thank you.
Sorry, I'm just conscious about time. What we'll do, thank you first of all, thank you everybody who's asked and contributed some questions. I know there's a few questions we've left out. I'll try and probably get Keith or Ben to probably respond in the chat box after our call if it's possible. But just a few things from us and talking about our upcoming future webinars, how to get in contact with us, for example. So if you could just scan our QR code, it'll link you to our leadership and management courses. You can either ask for my colleague Andrea, she's also responsible for our UK training, or myself. I'm the UK account manager at the Civil Service College, or my colleague Deborah for all in-house learning coordination needs. Future webinars, same thing. Just take out your phone, scan our QR code, register here, and it'll tell you of all our upcoming webinars. And obviously, we'll be looking forward to seeing everybody there. So if we can, let's do that. But thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for joining on time. Thank you to Keith and Ben. At this point, normally, if it was a live, if we're in person, I'll probably say let's give them a round of applause, but let's try something different today. If we can, there we go. The virtual claps, I appreciate that. So superb. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks so much for joining, everyone. Really appreciate
Thank you for
such a big
joining.
attendance.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.
Thank you, folks. Thank you.
Even hearts. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. They're not for
The heart
me.
is always nice, isn't it? Yeah.
They're all for you, Tendai.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers now.
Should I stop sharing, Tendai, or shall I leave this up for a bit?